Hi everyone, this is Nathan from Snap and welcome to another of our Snap XMP webinars. This is the third of 3 webinars in our mini-series titled Group Questionnaires and 360 Surveys. In the first session we looked at the design aspect of a group questionnaire, which enabled a series of similar questionnaires to be distributed to a participant list using a single survey link invitation. Part 2 looked at the analysis side of a group questionnaire, and today we will be focusing on using similar functionality to produce a 360 survey. For those of you who have joined me in parts 1 and 2, you will know that there's quite a few elements to a group questionnaire, and the same is true for a 360 survey. In fact, even more so because we're going to be using something known as a connector to add participants to our database. Today I'm going to attempt to show you some of the design setup and also some of the analysis. It is going to be fast-paced, but do remember that as always we'll be putting a recording up on the support hub in a day or two, so you can go back and watch it again, pausing it as you go along. And on that note, at the end I'll be pointing you off to a number of other webinars we've done recently in support materials which you might find useful alongside today's webinar. There's 3 main elements to today's 360 survey. The employees nominate who they'd like to give feedback on them. Completing this form will add those nominated people onto the mailing list of the main evaluation survey. This main evaluation survey is typically completed by a number of colleagues, which would also include the employee's manager or managers, their peers. So here we're talking about people who are the same sort of level as them, and their subordinates, so someone who perhaps reports to them. It would also be completed by that employee themselves. And when it comes to the analysis, we will then be looking at how your own views about yourself compare about the views of others about you. Few key benefits or reasons to create a 360 survey. Self-management of evaluators. By this I mean that the mailing list is created by the individual employees themselves. So if I want a colleague A, colleague C, D and T to evaluate me, I nominate them, and in doing so they get added to the mailing list automatically. All the data is contained in one survey ready for analysis, so we aren't having to merge data sets. Because of this, we can make use of smart reporting to automate our analysis. And this gives us the opportunity to compare or benchmark our own data against the views of others. A 360 survey does require a fair bit of setup initially, but once it's done, it's self-functioning. We need 2 surveys. The first survey is a nominator form, which allows someone to state who they'd like to evaluate them. It's going to be set up as a group questionnaire, meaning that they click an initial link and then they click on any subsequent links within their own content page, specifying the different people who they wish to evaluate them. The nominator survey is sent out to each member of staff who is going to participate in the survey. So each member of staff will be getting an invitation. So there'll be an email invitation set up. The second survey is the actual evaluation form, which each person will complete, but each of the people that they are evaluating. We also need 2 spreadsheets, one for each of the surveys. As the nominator survey is a group questionnaire, you'll remember from my previous webinar that it's got multiple lines for each person. So in our scenario today, we're talking about a particular staff member nominating a number of different colleagues to complete a survey about them. So that staff member will be mentioned on this spreadsheet multiple times, so 1 row for each nominee that they wish to give feedback on. The second spreadsheet is for the evaluation survey. Something called a connector is going to be set up on this survey, and that means that each time a nomination is made, so each time a particular member of staff nominates someone to evaluate them, their details will be automatically updated in this spreadsheet. But it will initially contain each member of staff, as each member or each participant in a 360 survey is also required to evaluate themselves. So in my example here, I've got, I think, 20 members of staff. They will each evaluate themselves as part of the 360 survey. Okay, let's head into the software to have a look at the setup of these surveys. So first of all, I'm going to go into the evaluation survey. So we're going to do it a little bit back to front today to begin with. So looking at the 360 evaluation survey. So you can see this is the survey which will be used to evaluate each member of staff. And if I do a quick preview of the survey, just so you can see it working live. So as you go through, you can see I've got a number of different sort of section headers. And it's basically a series of sections asking people to read various statements and decide whether that's something that they've not observed or observed rarely through to consistently. So there's quite a few different sections here, so I'll leave that one there for the time being. Go back to the survey in Snap. Now I'm just going to quickly pop into the phone edition, and I'm just going to preview the phone edition a second. Now it's worth just bearing in mind that I'll just set this up to make it look a bit more like a phone a second. So I've actually set up these grid questions to be carousel questions. So personally, I think these work really well when you've got these sort of longer statements as opposed to just one or two words. So that's just, I decided that I wanted to set up the survey in that way. I'll go back into the survey itself. So because I wanted the main PC edition and tablet edition to display as a standardized grid, these were initially set up as normal grid questions, and then for the smartphone version, a grid would normally be displayed as a drop-down menu, but I wanted to force it to be a carousel question. What I've also done is effectively turn off the fact that it would normally be a drop-down menu. As I said, if you decided in your example you wanted all your questions to be carousel questions, then actually you would probably just choose the carousel question in the first place, and that would set all the additions to be carousels. Looking back at the main setup, you can see I have a number of hidden questions at the top of the survey. I'll just show these a second. So these are going to be seeded by the nominator form. So when someone fills in the nominator form, they give various information, and that information will get pulled into this survey. As part of that, you can see it specifies who that member of staff is in relation to the person that they're evaluating. So are they the manager of them? Are they evaluating themselves, etc. So all these hidden questions at the top, they're going to be used to form the analysis of the survey. But also, you can see I've seeded the name of the person who they're evaluating into the survey itself, just to remind the person what they're doing. What I've also done is specify that certain sections are only going to be filled out by effectively someone if they are a manager to that person. So Q0 equals 3, that relates back to this one here. So if they're a direct report to someone, then they will see that section. If not, they won't. Apart from that, it's a fairly straightforward survey. Just hide those again. If we now head into my nominator survey, I close this survey down a second. Okay, if we go into the nominator form, again, we've got some hidden questions at the top of the survey. So this time, these questions will be seeded in from the spreadsheet, which is used to send out the emails to each and every member of staff. And remember that every single member of staff will be asked to nominate people. So every So the spreadsheet has every single email address for every member of staff in the company. This is going to be a group questionnaire. So we've got the ID survey index turned on. So again, this relates back to my previous couple of webinars when we were talking about group questionnaires. So under Power Data, I've got survey index turned on. And you remember this is the variable which effectively turns this into a looping survey. So the survey sort of loops over and over again, returning each time to a personalized contents page. Again, I'm just going to do a quick preview of this one to see this one in action. So obviously when this is a live survey, it will be specifying some content from those hidden questions at the top. So it'd be a case of putting my details in, saying what relationship they are to me, pressing submit. That will then loop round to the next person for me to input. So you'll see that in action live in just a second. Okay, so that's my two surveys set up in desktop. Let's now have a look at the surveys and how they're set up in Snap Online. So I've got my nominator form and my survey. If we look at the nominator form, so in my organisation or my pretend organisation today, there's 20 members of staff in total. Every single member of staff is on the mailing list already, so they will be invited to nominate whoever they want to nominate to fill out data about them. So if I go into the Collect tab and go into Participants and my participant list, I'm just going to show you the spreadsheet which is used to create that in just a second. So I've got my spreadsheet on my desktop. So as I said, this is the nominator survey. And if you remember, because it's a group questionnaire, each person is on this spreadsheet multiple times. So there's me as a sort of dummy employee, my email address. Obviously, I've got all my other employees on there. So 20 members of staff, but you can see there's actually 180 lines on there because I'm asking each person to nominate up to 9 people to evaluate myself. Plus, I will be evaluating myself as well. So actually, there'll be up to maybe 10 people giving feedback on myself, but that does include me. So I've got my different headers. And if we look at the survey in Snap Online, I've already done this, but I'm just going to take you through the process. So we'd upload some participants. Just going to do an update. I go and find the spreadsheet on my desktop. So it's grabbing data from my spreadsheet. So who's it going to email? What ID are we using? As I said, it's a group questionnaire. So more information about that in the previous webinar. I'm going to be taking data from the spreadsheet to personalize the invitation. I'm seeding those hidden questions at the top of the survey with some of my column headers. And that's uploaded that. We've also got the invitation. So standard invitation, got my company logo in there, basically telling people that they can nominate up to 9 people. And effectively this link is the link to that group questionnaire. So if we look at the invitation in real life, so if I go into my emails, so I've received an email from the InCrowd, which is my company name, asking me to make some nominations. You can see it's personalized my email with my name, and it's asked me to nominate some people. So we'll have a look at, I'll do some nominations in just a second. I wanted to show you it actually working in real life. If we now head back to Snap Online and look at the evaluation survey. Again, if we look at my spreadsheet this time, so this is the spreadsheet which is going to be used to send out the evaluations to each person. So at the moment, this contains every member of staff on there because every member of staff is going to be evaluating themselves. So effectively, Nathan, which is me, is going to also be evaluating me. And Annie Jones is going to evaluate Annie Jones. Obviously, a bit later, I may well evaluate all of these people, but initially, the only person I'm going to be evaluating is effectively myself. Okay. Later on, this spreadsheet will be added to automatically. So again, back into Snap Online and look at my participants. And again, got my 20 people on there at the moment who are all going to evaluate themselves with my invitation. This time it's a standard invitation, again grabbing data from my spreadsheet. So I don't know if you noticed earlier, but there was a column called content for email, and in there it said yourself. So this is the email which is going to go out to me, and it's going to say please provide feedback, and this particular feedback form relates to yourself, whilst in other situations it will say this particular feedback relates to John or Terry, etc. Now this survey is set up using what we call a connector. So I've got my participant list with my 20 members of staff on at the moment, but every time someone fills in the nomination form, effectively they are going to be connected to this survey. So if I go into my connector, you can see I've already set this up. I'm going to edit it. So I'm going to be connecting another survey, and every time that survey is connected, there's going to be people added onto this survey, added onto the mailing list. So I'm grabbing data from the nominator form. So a connector, again, there's I've done a webinar on this. I'm going to point you to that at the end about connectors, but we're going to be pulling data from the connector form. We're going to be grabbing data from that other survey. So these are questions in the nominator form. Again, for the invitation, it's going to be taking data from that nominating form. So effectively, rather than taking more data from the spreadsheet in the first place, what it's really doing is taking data from the nominator form. Now, you do need to be a bit careful here because it can get really confusing with a 360 survey, because you have people who are nominators. They are nominating people to evaluate you. So at one point, one person might be an evaluator, but a little bit later, they're going to be a nominator. So you can very easily get confused as to which questions are being linked with which. So it's really important that you do try and name questions sensibly. And just bear in mind, as I said, in one survey, it might make sense to call something the nominator name, whilst in the other survey, that same person might be the evaluator name. So yeah, do need to certainly do lots and lots of testing when you're doing this. Okay, so we've seen all the setup, albeit very quickly. We're now going to have a look at it in action. So going back to my emails. So I've got my nomination form where I'm going to nominate maybe 5 or 6 members of staff. Plus I've been asked to actually provide some feedback for myself. So if I go into my nomination form, so I'm going to go through and nominate some people. So I can nominate up to 9 people. So there's potentially options for me to add 9 contact details in here. So I'm going to go through and add some people. So Betty is my manager. You can see it's a group questionnaire, so it's looped back. So I've already added my contact 1. I'm now going to add contact 2. Here's Tanya. So this is me, I said, nominating who I want to provide feedback on me. And Tanya is my reports to me. I'm going to add one more. It's going to be Malcolm. And Malcolm is my peer, so they're kind of in line with me. So I've added 3 people. When I'll go back into my participant list, you can see I've now got, in fact, if I go back to the overview, there were originally 20 people on this list, which was the original 20 members of staff being asked to fill in this survey to evaluate themselves. You can see there's actually now 23 people who are going to be asked to evaluate themselves. And the 3 people I added was Betty Short, Malcolm Short, and Tanya Marder. So as you can see, every time someone's filling in the evaluation or the nomination form, their details are being added to effectively this spreadsheet, which will then in turn email out all those people asking them to evaluate me. Okay, so let's now turn our attention to the analysis side of a 360 survey. So I'm going to head back to Desktop Snap. And if we go back into my evaluation survey, because that's where all the actual analysis is done. Now, because we're looking mainly at sliding scales, as in the rarely to consistently, and particularly because we want to easily compare data against different sets of respondents, so I want to compare sort of my views of myself versus what everyone else thinks of them, what I'm actually going to be doing is converting this into a scoring system. And to do that, we've got a weight setup. We've got a weight. And effectively what this is doing is allocating a score to each of these values. So rarely is going to be worth 1 point, and consistently is going to be worth 4 points. Obviously, if someone hasn't observed it, I effectively want to exclude them, so it's not applicable. Okay. Now, if we look at our analysis, so I've got some tables and charts that I've produced. Now, I'm not going to be spending sort of a great deal of time, to be honest, on analysis today, because a lot of it is based on sort of stuff we did in previous webinars, but I'm just going to open up a chart I've got here. So it's a chart looking at my views versus the views of the manager, but again, based on this scoring system. So based on that score of 1 to 4, by the looks of it, my manager, in terms of respects other team members, has given me a 4. I gave myself a 3. So they said I'm consistently, I said quite often, whilst other people sort of say somewhere between rarely and occasionally sort of thing. Now, if we go into the properties of that table, so we can see that it's looking at the data for V10. Now, V10 actually is a derived variable which relates back to Q10. So in the original Q10, we go into my variables. The Q10 question had the original list of 1 to 5, but remember, anyone that didn't observe, we don't really want to be interested in them. So what I've actually got for each of my questions, I've got a derived variable equivalent. So B7 relates to Q7, B4 relates to Q4, etc. But if we look at V10, so doing a couple of things in here. First of all, it's transforming the data from Q10. It's applying that weight, so that score of 1 to 4 to it. But you can also see anyone who chose option 1, which was effectively didn't observe, is going to be excluded from the data. So what this drive variable also does is allow me to potentially rename any of the label text to make it a bit more succinct. Okay. But going back to my chart, so it's looking at the average score based on V10, which is looking at the weighting system. And you can see it's also got a filter on there based on employee. Now, employee is another derived variable I've got. And employee is what I'm using actually to work out who each and every person is. Now, in my survey, I have people are nominating people based on names, etc. The reason I'm using this derived variable and basing it on email address is that I know the email address is going to be correct, because if it wasn't correct, the person wouldn't have received the email in the first place and they wouldn't have been able to give feedback. If we were to try and base it solely on the name, the problem is that people are known by different names. I might nominate one person using one name. I might get that name misspell the name. I might end up using a nickname, etc. So you'd end up having consistencies and people not being grouped together. So by using email address, it's a way of making sure that it captures everyone to do with that particular person. Now, I'm not really going to go into too much more on sort of all the different types of tables and charts that you could run, but what I will do is actually run one of the reports that I've produced. Again, very much based on what we've done in previous webinars. So I've got a number of smaller sort of mini reports, and then I've got one report which is actually pulling everything through. I've tried to give some information just to remind me what I'm supposed to be doing. So before you run the report, you need to choose who the subject is, and by subject I'm referring to sort of who's this report about. So when I press the play button, I can go to context. If you're doing analysis based on sort of years and months and stuff, then you could certainly break down information here. Today we're just basing it on everyone who's filled it in, full stop. So if I was to run a report for me, I preview that report, I get an introduction telling me sort of how many people effectively filled in the survey about me. So 14 colleagues filled it in. That does include me. And down the bottom is telling me sort of who those colleagues are. Well, not who they are, but kind of what level they are. And then I've got information here where it's comparing the different section headers. So there were around about 9 or 10 different section headers. It's got my score on that 0 to 4 compared to what everyone else thought it was. So by the looks of it, for communication, I scored myself slightly lower than all my colleagues did. Whilst as a team player, it looks like I thought I was doing a little bit better than everyone else thinks I'm doing. Okay. So obviously not a lot of difference between those ones. Whilst organisation, alignment, it looks like, yeah, I'm rating myself quite a bit lower than everyone else is on average. With different analysis, again, breaking it down by the different sections. So again, the different sort of sub-questions, and then the average score based on potentially the 4 different employee types. Okay. So again, not really going to go into sort of how this report was actually set up, because that's another webinar, but I can then obviously run the report again. This time I could perhaps choose a different employee. So we'll go with Betty Short. Betty's had 11 responses. And obviously this is all of Betty's data. Now today I'm just running these reports in Snap Desktop. We could set them up to be viewed by the individuals themselves. So we could, everyone could set themselves up with a Snap Online account, a free analysis account. They could then go in and sort of self-serve and just run their own report whenever they want. And they would only have access to their own data. Obviously they couldn't, it's not like Betty could go in and run off the report for me. I would specify that Betty's only got permissions to view her own data. So that's one option. The other option is to run the reports yourself in desktop and then email them to people. And if I was just to run a report for Betty, and actually I'll print this one off into context. Betty. Just run that one and print that off to PDF on my desktop. You can already see what I'm about to say, the fact that the reports are automatically naming themselves based on who that report was for. Okay, and there's Betty's report. So yeah, so that could just be emailed off to Betty manually, or as I said, better still, we could set these reports up to be viewed using Snap Online. Okay, so hopefully that's given you an insight into what a 360 project is, and also shown you a little bit about the setup involved. Obviously, it's not to say that you have to set your survey up in the way that I've set mine up, but hopefully you'll see some of the benefits to the way that I've done that, particularly using the connector to effectively automatically build the mailing list for the second survey. On screen now are a few QR codes which will take you off to our support hub pages. The first two QR codes will take you off to the group questionnaires webinars, which cover both the design of a group questionnaire in the first place in a bit more detail, and also the analysis. Obviously, I've really quickly shown you some analysis tonight or this afternoon, but there's a lot more in part 2 for the group questionnaires webinar. And then the third QR code is for the connectors webinar, which was the one where we effectively connected the nominator survey to the evaluator survey. So that's where the spreadsheet was automatically updated. If you have got a spare 2 minutes, I'd be grateful if you would complete our short survey about today's webinar, which is accessed on the right. You will receive an email in the next couple of hours or so, which will include the actual links to these different resources that I've given you. So if you haven't got access to QR code readers, then you can just click on the links as well. Thank you for joining me today, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.